Welcome to today's live stream. We're talking about 9/11 Trillions, a short documentary done by James Corbett, part of his overall investigations into 9/11. He's done a fantastic job. You can find his stuff at corbettreport.com. One of the things that James frequently says when he talks about 9/11 or other similar events, that primarily what we're talking about is a crime. And one of the ways that you can follow a crime is to look at the money. Who benefits? And look at the money. This is distracted from by crying terrorism and getting people afraid, so they don't take a rational look at what's going on. There's so much money that bears investigating when it comes to September 11th. He starts us with a timeline, which I think would be worth revisiting. 1998, the World Trade Center is privatized. Larry Silverstein leads a consortium of investors, himself only pledging about $14 million. He wanted to insure the buildings for double what they previously were insured for, which was about $1 billion. And later on, when the attacks happened, he wanted to argue for two separate terror events. So if you insure both buildings for 3.2, the whole site for 3.2 million, then you can argue, oh, I was hit, these two buildings were hit, I want 7.1 billion. The court doesn't agree with this reasoning. He ends up getting 4.55 billion. And people have to realize it's not like a lottery. An insurance claim is not a lottery. It is based on probabilities, and there has to be money set aside in a bank account to pay out insurance claims. These people were not prepared, but they ended up settling for $4.55 billion, of which only 1 billion was used to build what is now called the Freedom Tower, by some people, One World Trade Center, if you want to call it that. That means that he netted out the rest in profit effectively. He made $3.5 billion in profit on the destruction of the three buildings, which he had control of that day. Remember, Building 7 is the building that nobody knows about, no one ever wants to talk about, but no one can explain exactly why it fell into its own footprint at a free fall speed. In addition, he wanted to sue, not wanted, I think he attempted to sue American Airlines and United Airlines for negligence. Thankfully, I think that was dismissed. But if you look at what that works out to, it's something like $1.1 million per each American that died that day. That's how much they were worth. You have 3,000, sorry, not 1.1. It'd be 100, like, do the math. take the 3.5 billion, divide it by 3,000 Americans, and you'll have exactly how much each of those Americans was worth that day to him. And as Leo notes in the chat, pretty lucky insuring the towers right before 9/11, almost as if it were planned, Leo. Almost as if he knew something was going to happen. And as we talked about in a previous 9/11 documentary, he started, and he said it, he announced it in Israel when he went to visit, he started bringing designers to look at the redesign of the World Trade Center in 2000. I think August or September of 2000. Now, how could you do a redesign of the World Trade Center unless it was going to be demolished? And how were you going to demolish it unless you knew it was going to be demolished? But pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Inside the buildings, both at the Pentagon and at the towers, both World Trade Center 1 and 2, as well as 7, you have investigations going on that need to be shut down, or at least need to be severely hampered. Now, the first one that Corbett focuses on is Marsh and McLennan's paperless transactions with AIG that is happening. Now, why do you want this paperless transaction technology? Probably less obvious in that time period, in the 2001 period now. These days, we understand, or we're used to seeing paperless transactions. But back then it was new, and there was a high volume of these happening. Furthermore, there was a surge in transactions before the attacks. But this is pre-cloud, so there weren't things that were being there weren't things that were being saved somewhere on to someone else's computer, which is really what the cloud is, if we remember that. That these things were not being saved somewhere. So if you destroy the records at the location, they're gone. So where is Marsh and McLennan? Between floors 93 and 100. Where does one of those planes hit? Surprisingly. Now, I'm not one to believe necessarily in the accuracy of poorly trained Saudi hijackers. So I much more believe in the idea of either an autopilot or a drone hitting that and explosives being planted there to correspond with the time of the impact. Because it's too precise to think this pilot, not only he's no good as a pilot, but he's also going to be able to navigate at high speed which floors of the building I'm going to hit. So the fact that these offices were hit leads me to believe that there was some sort of corresponding detonation in these floors to match whatever hit the building. And we talked about before, I'm open to hearing other theories about it other than it being the actual airliner. It could have been a drone that looked exactly like it, but that's a discussion for another time. A firm called Convar brags not too long after the attacks that they're going to be able to recover some of the data from here. And they show some messy floppy disks. Young people, if you don't know what floppy disks are, not floppy disks, hard drive disks. But in any case, they said that they were going to be able to find it. Years later, they were asked, they said, I'm sorry, I can't tell you anything more about that now. Let me get this straight. You bragged that you were going to be able to find out information on these drives. If you don't find any information, what would be the harm of just admitting we can't find any information on here? End of story. But instead, he says, I'm sorry, I can't comment on that. I can't comment on that. More on that. Mihao, did you consider option of CGI? Not many cameras back then, quite possible. I don't know that CGI, I know, and I always know military is always tracking 10 or 20 years above what we're used to in the civilian world. However, based on all of the camera footage that we have, the idea that a three-dimensional CGI flying object was there that day, for me, it doesn't matter insofar as whether it was a CGI, whether it was energy weapons, whether it was lasers. The point is, there's foreknowledge, people planned it, and it wasn't Saudi hijackers being directed by bin Laden in a cave. So however it comes, I'm fine with. So the idea that it could be a 3D CGI, I'm not opposed to it. The point is, explosions happened. There were explosions in the buildings. It brought the buildings down. Whatever hit the building didn't bring it down, whether it was CGI or whether it were planes or whether it were drones. So what else is important to note? That's what's going on September 11th. We're going to go to different sites. Just across the street, Building 7. The SEC is investigating securities fraud relating to Enron in that building. Well, guess what happens when that building collapses? All those files disappear. In the Pentagon, there is a wing of the Pentagon in which the accountants are sitting. Coincidentally, huge coincidence, I'm sure it has nothing to do with anything, that wing is hit on September 11th. On September the 10th, there is a press conference, which is highlighted in this documentary, of Donald Rumsfeld admitting to not knowing the location of $2.3 trillion. Now, to put this in perspective, and if you don't know anything about accounting or bookkeeping, what happens with transactions, things get charged. Say, all right, I'm just going to make up numbers. This is $10. So normally when you're doing an audit for something like the Pentagon or any business, you have to take the charge for $10 and match it to something. So it says we spent $10 for gas. Okay, here's a receipt for $10 for gas on the same day. Okay, that matches. And still, I mean, it's inconceivable. This is an aside. It's not ad rem to what we're discussing today, but $7.6 trillion in expenses by the Pentagon, that is extraordinary. That is crazy. And you have to know that most of that money is going to express American hegemony through all of our bases, the total number of which is unknown in the world. 3.5 trillion of the 7.6 is supported, meaning they had some kind of receipt, right? I have this. They then said 2.3 were fudged. Now, this is an American idiom for saying they just made it work. So going back to the receipt, let's say it was a $10 charge and you have a receipt for $7.37 and it's on the same day or 2 days before. And you say, well, the dates don't match, the amount doesn't match, but we're going to make it work. They even had a name, they called it plugs. So this happened so frequently in the Pentagon that they had an idiom used for it. So of the 7.6, 3.5 supported, 2.3 fudged. They made up whether it was going to work or not. 1.8, they didn't even have the time to fudge. What does that tell you? It tells me that the majority of the Pentagon transactions were not properly correlated. Now, you could say that's just sloppy, but where there's sloppiness, there's also fraud, as we're seeing in what Elon and his nerd team is uncovering in the United States. So certainly where it comes to military black budgets, 100% that's going to be happening. So strangely, and again, hugely coincidentally, that part of the Pentagon is hit by whatever hits the Pentagon. And all of the accountants, I think the documentary says like 40 accountants, they're all dead. The people who are working on this issue. The records are gone because there's no cloud. World Trade Center, Building 7, the SEC is in there. That's all gone. All those files are gone. And the World Trade Center building itself, where you have Marsh and McLennan executing these trades, Deutsche Bank executing trades, Convar saying, oh, we thought we could recover stuff and we didn't recover stuff. All these things mysteriously happened. On top of that, something I didn't know before watching this documentary, and I'm ashamed I didn't, is we always talk about the put options on United Airlines and American Airlines on September 10th. And we know that people had foreknowledge that something was going to happen, and they bet against the airlines. But what I also found out is there were bets against Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Marsh, the company that we're discussing here. A number of put options were put on these banks and these financial institutions because they would suffer as well being hit in New York. However, there were also calls on Raytheon. Now, if you realize, get a little bit into the stock world, a put option is a bet that the stock is going to go down. So you put a bet on that and you want to be able to buy stock at this price to exploit the difference. A call is the opposite of a put. It's the ability to buy a stock at a lower price because you're betting it's going to go up. Well, there are a number of call options put on Raytheon, which is a weapons manufacturer. They manufacture weapons of mass destruction, which, remember, we were never able to find in Iraq, but Raytheon has them. And call options were put on. So you have a bunch of people who had knowledge and decided we're going to make some money from this. We're going to kill some Americans. We're going to start a war in the Middle East. But while we're doing that, doesn't it make sense to make some money? And turns out we have members of the Bush family on the Walker side who profited from this. A number of investigation, multiple research papers Corbett cites, and he gives names and dates for these research papers. And they verified the impossibility or the high unlikelihood of these multiple random puts and calls and trades happening at this frequency, at these amounts. I think the statistic was something like 90 times the number of normal put options were put onto these banks on this day specifically. We also have officials from Belgium and Germany who concluded that there was foreknowledge. Corbett also shows this famous clip of Bob Bayer talking to some citizen journalists who says, I know a guy who went to his broker on September the 10th in San Diego, said, cash me out, it's going down tomorrow. And then Bayer added parenthetically, his brother works at the White House. And Corbett asks, why hasn't Bob Bayer been asked who this person was? How did this person know to cash out on September the 10th? What did his brother at the White House know? The Carlyle Group, which is an investment group that George W. Bush's father, George Herbert Walker Bush, is part of, majority shareholder in, or maybe not a majority shareholder, but a serious shareholder in. They were meeting at the Ritz-Carlton in Washington, D.C. on September 11th. I'm sure it was a coincidence. So we have all of these coincidences happening, and people notice the last part of the documentary may be the most sinister because it's something that is probably still happening now, and that's the identification of the software company known as PTech. Now, PTech is software that helps with risk assessment and risk mitigation. So you're able to have what they refer to as a God's eye view within a system architecture. So let's say you plug it in, and I'm going to list the names of the organizations: FBI, IRS, NATO, the U.S. Post Office, the SEC, the Secret Service, the White House. These are just some of the clients of PTech at that time. And the person interviewing, I think she worked for Morgan Stanley or she worked for a bank, and everyone said you should look at PTech. Now, what PTech does is they install their software across your entire enterprise system so that they can monitor everything that's going on. And the ruse is we can that way, we'll see if someone's trying to launder money. We'll see if somebody's changing passwords in a dangerous area. That's the idea. And to a certain extent, that makes sense. But the classic Roman idiom, who watches the watchman, should be important here. But you have to realize you have to really trust your people. It's that software that everyone, you might not know of it, but it's called LastPass. But LastPass holds a bunch of passwords for people. But that means you better hope LastPass never gets hacked. It's like Pam Bondi, the U.S. Attorney General, saying, oh, well, I don't think anyone knows how to hack Signal, so Signal should be safe. So you're basically putting a dare out there for all the nerds, saying that I'm sure it's not hackable. So PTech, you're betting that PTech's not hackable. You're betting that there are no bad actors within PTech. But this begs the question, why would you hire PTech to help surveil your organization if you didn't believe there could be bad actors in it? If you think there could be bad actors inside the White House, inside the Secret Service, inside NATO, inside the FBI, why couldn't there be bad actors inside PTech? Now, PTech had at least one person who was sanctioned by the U.S. for involvement in terror activities, who was sitting on their board, but it seems he got access via a shell company and invested in PTech. Well, as anyone knows, if you're an investor in a company, you have access to things within a company that maybe some employees don't have, that shareholders don't have. And clearly, this person could have used access to also one of the organizations, the FAA. And if the FAA is giving you access to their organization so you can find out where the holes are, that means you know where the holes are and you can pass them on to bad parties, willingly or no. Because if you give access to people who you trust, but you don't realize are actually working for bad counterparties, then you are giving them access. And that's what happened here. And PTech, at best, is suspicious. At worst, is complicit. Let's take a look. Artur, for me, just the fact Larry bought the towers 2 months before they fell and made 4.5 billion. Yeah, Artur, we talked a little bit about the numbers at the very beginning of the stream. Is enough to know he knew. Not only he knew, he was probably part of the planning committee. He wasn't just some stooge where they said, hey, Larry, stand here and this is all going to happen. Don't do anything. He was clearly complicit in some way. They found tons of molten metal at the site too. Takes 2,800 degrees. This is discussed and 9/11 mysteries and loose change. If you look in our film clubs, if I remember, I'll try to put a link in the descriptions to our previous discussions there. But that obviously talks about the structures. Today we're talking about the money only, but good point for bringing that up, Artur. Well, this is disclosed, but we have secret bases in countries that are not disclosed. So we have bases in Romania, other places that are black sites that are not. If you watch the film Zero Dark 30, the part about killing bin Laden, I think, is probably fictional, but a lot of the other tradecraft that's in there is correct. And you see a black site there, a site which is not disclosed where torture is going on. So as you say, according to Google only knows what it's told. It doesn't know what it's not told. What happened to Indira Singh? I think you're referring to the lady who disclosed PTech. Again, we'd have to ask the internet. I'm going to say that was my fault for not following up on that, probably because it was towards the end of the documentary and I had not verified what happened to her. But if anyone knows what happened to Indira Singh, please put that in the chat. Okay, so the main takeaway from today's documentary and hopefully today's stream is when we're looking at 9/11, you need to consider it a crime. Crimes have to be investigated. Crimes aren't just investigated for the perpetrator angle. That's one part of it. But going beyond that, asking who benefits, follow the money trail. And if you do that here, as Corbett leads us numerous trails to, trails that are not answered, who would be the person to answer it? It would be the US government. We have the SEC stating there is no evidence that people who were tied to the attacks did these trades. But as Corbett notes, that isn't what we asked for. There's a scene in The Fugitive, one of my favorite movies of all time, in which they're talking to a janitor who's helping the Harrison Ford character. And he answers the wrong question. They ask him a question and he says, "Oh, I haven't seen Dr. Kimball." And he says, "Oh, we didn't ask about Dr. Kimball." And so look at the answer you're giving and see if it's related to the question you were asking. So was the question they were asking that the people who did the attacks did the trades? No. The question was, did people have foreknowledge of the events? You didn't have to actually do the events to have foreknowledge of the events. Those are two different people. Could be both. But all the SEC said was there was no evidence that the people who did the attacks did the financial trades. That seems pretty reasonable. But that wasn't the question that was asked. The question was there foreknowledge? We have officials from Belgium and Germany who said that there was. We have a company, Convar, who refuses to admit or even talk about the fact that they did data recovery at one of the companies that was involved in paperless transactions on the attack, that there were the people who were looking at suspicious transactions happening at Marsh & McLennan were all in that building for a conference call, except their supervisor who was off-site in Manhattan. Again, I'm sure it's all a coincidence. I'm sure it has nothing to do with each other. So as Corbett leads us through all these different trails, we have to ask, why does the US government not answer? In part because the US government must have been complicit in some way. And the 9/11 Commission report, when asked, what about this money question? It says no substantial reason to really pursue it. Or we don't really think it's that important. I don't remember the quote, but it was ridiculous. P-Tech was finally raided. They were given 2 weeks advance notice before the raid. And huge surprise, they didn't find anything. But I'm sure that was just a coincidence. Remember that the people referenced in here were signatories to Rebuilding America's Defenses, the white paper put out by the Project for the New American Century, which wanted more U.S. hegemony. But they said in there that's only going to happen via a galvanizing event like a new Pearl Harbor. And September 11th was certainly a new Pearl Harbor for America. But I think enough time has passed now that people are willing to take a look at it. Things are now released about the Kennedy assassination. And you have people like Ben Shapiro, horrible Zionist, saying, does it really matter? Does it really matter who killed Kennedy? Does it really matter how many people were killed in World War II? Does it really matter that a certain group of people are claiming a certain number and that you have to go to jail if you don't agree with that number? It doesn't matter. Ben Shapiro says it doesn't matter, so I guess it doesn't matter. All right. If there are any other thoughts, comments, questions, I will answer them. Otherwise, I will wrap up because I've got to get ready for the next live stream, which will be happening over at Palestine Bookshelf in about 7 minutes. We're going to be discussing Killing Gaza, which was a very fine, very, very, very fine documentary put together by Dan Cohen and Max Blumenthal. I think it was released in 2016, 17, but it was based on events that happened in Gaza in 2014. And we'll be talking about that over there. So if you're interested in hearing more about Gaza specifically and these unbelievably awesome Palestinian people, I tell you, the more I learn about them, the more I see them, the more I interact with them, I'm just in awe of who they are as people on the natural level. And we'll be talking about that over on the other channel. Okay, I don't see any other questions. So thanks for joining. And we will see you around this time next week. We'll be continuing to talk about 9/11 and breaking apart different aspects that, as I say, James Corbett has gone ahead and done a lot of the work for us. So all we have to do is examine the arguments he's putting forward. Thanks for joining. Like I said, if you'd like to join on Palestine Bookshelf, please hop over there. I'll be there in a moment.